22 News Broadcast Center. This is 22 News in Focus.
Good afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Don Schiffman. We're talking about sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. It is the unexplained death, usually during sleep and seemingly with healthy babies less than a year old. Now, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2017, there were more than 3,500 sudden, unexpected infant deaths in the United States, with nearly half due to SIDS. The cause is unknown, but researchers have identified some risk factors. So joining me today to discuss this medical mystery are Dr. Andrew Balder, a pediatrician with Bay State Health, and Hamden District Attorney Anthony Gallooni. So thanks both of you for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to start with you, Doctor, because I want to get kind of a differentiation here between what is sudden unexpected infant death versus sudden infant death syndrome. Two different things here?
One's a subset of the other, Don, and that actually has been a subject of discussion for a number of decades because the definition keeps shifting and changing.
Because we like to say SIDS.
That's right, and historically we have said SIDS, and certainly when I was in training a number of decades ago, that was the term, and this term sudden unexplained infant death didn't exist at that time. But as people have started to tease apart different causes, different things that occur in the location of death, and have started to pull out some of these where you can identify probable causes, there's been a shifting in the terminology. Say that SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome, the traditional term, is now really for the subset where it's truly unexplained. You can't point to suffocation for sure, you can't point to serious and significant events that occurred that would have resulted in death specifically. So that becomes a subset of the larger term, sudden unexplained infant death syndrome, or SIDS, as one of my partners says.
What was it? Say it again?
He says SIDS,
Okay,
S-U-I-D-S.
all right.
That accounts for, I think, the totality, not the majority of death primarily during sleep, whether or not you can identify probable or possible causes or no cause at all, or SIDS.
So we're talking about the cause here, and that's why we also want to talk about the law enforcement aspect of that. We're going to get into that with you, with the DA. But first, let's talk about what are the causes. It's a big question, isn't it?
It's a huge question, and we tend to lump together causes with risk factors.
Okay.
But if you try to look at the science, you try to look at why does this happen with some babies and not others? There are clearly some internal problems where there's a difficulty regulating breathing under certain circumstances with some kids and not others, but that problem will not express itself until some other risk occurs. We now talk about babies should sleep alone on their backs alone in a crib. Mm-hmm. We can get to back to sleep as a movement later, but think about loose objects, think about other individuals. Think about baby bumpers, blankets, et cetera, things that can then get close to the face and interfere with breathing, perhaps. There are other risk factors that have to do with environmental circumstances, such as cigarette smoke and other smoke. And interestingly, that may be at the time the child, after they're born or when they're alive. It may also be exposure during prenatal years, where there's something to that as well. The causes aren't worked out to the nth degree, but we start to see this common pattern of things evolving in the thinking of why are some children at more risk than others.
So everything that you laid out right there brings me to you, because these types of deaths can be really difficult to investigate, I would suspect. So what goes into it for you on your side, on the legal side of all of this?
Sure. So by state statute, the Hamden District Attorney here in Hamden and district attorneys across the Commonwealth have original jurisdiction over any unattended death. So that includes everything from things that are known to be criminal, mm-hmm. as well as suicides and tragedies like baby deaths, to ensure there is no criminal aspect. They're awful tragedies for investigators and for prosecutors to work on, but very often we're realizing that these infant deaths have something to do with sleep conditions and with SIDS or SIDS, as been mentioned. So investigators are going in when these tragedies occur to make sure there's no criminal element. There was no abuse or anything to that effect.
Yeah, so walk me through some of the protocol here with that.
So the protocol is that a call will typically come in from a local police department. They'll get a call on an emergency basis that there's an unresponsive child, or depending on the situation. Then a call will come to my office, and the state troopers will work in my office at my direction regarding that there is a fatality, and investigators will go out. They'll begin a process by which they determine who was around at the time, who's responsible for the baby. They'll obviously look at the conditions and the very matters that surround the death to ensure there was no criminal activity. And again, very often these infant deaths are as a result of SIDS and sometimes sleeping conditions, which we're very much concerned with today and looking to educate the community in our partnership with Bay State.
Is there an autopsy that's involved usually with something like this?
It can be, depending on the level of suspicion. If there is a reason to believe there's some criminal activity at play, or it's not determined, an autopsy will result. Sometimes that has to do with input from the family. When the cause is natural or of some sort of disease and not criminal, and that is clear, an autopsy will not be conducted. But it depends on the circumstances of each case.
So what happens if there's no identifiable cause of death here then?
Well, it depends on those circumstances, but very often investigators are educated in my office. We're aware of the commonality, unfortunately, of SIDS and these kinds of deaths. Very often the causes are determined, but they are not criminal. So we're aware of accidents, and these are awful tragedies for parents and families to have to deal with.
And then I'm assuming then law enforcement works in tandem with the medical profession as well.
I would say certainly at the time of the event that is true. And in addition to that, we're fortunate in this county to have, actually every county in Massachusetts is supposed to have it, but we have a fairly vigorous child fatality review team, which is organized out of the district attorney's office. And these instances, as well as those involving older children, certainly will come back to that committee for review, and that group includes medical, one of my colleagues who's really a specialist in the area, law enforcement, district attorney, social service, DCF, all the players in the room looking at the circumstances around every death. So that becomes a major collaborative effort, out of which often come recommendations to the Attorney General, to the state government, to different departments on things that can be done to basically improve prevention.
Yeah, and I want to get into that coming up here. I want to talk more about the risk factors, also prevention. We're going to continue our conversation after a short break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. We're back here now, 22 News in Focus, and today we are talking about sudden infant death syndrome with Dr. Andrew Balder, a pediatrician with Bay State Health, and Hampden District Attorney Anthony Gallooni. So although sudden infant death syndrome can strike any infant, researchers have identified several factors that might increase a baby's risk. So let's talk more about the risk factors here. What are the physical factors associated with SIDS?
Well, I would say first and foremost, we've learned over the last few decades that sleep position is probably the major influenceable or modifiable risk factor. Those recommendation is that all babies sleep alone on their back in a crib, which is something that's developed only in the last 30 to 35 years. And it has been fairly well demonstrated that putting babies to sleep on their back, and I will say if they're old enough to roll over on their own, more power to them, fine.
Should we be moving them back though?
We should put them to sleep on their back. If they turn on their own, that's fine.
Let them sleep.
Right, but don't put them on their side and let them flip that way.
Gotcha.
It's from your back. But that is the principal modifiable risk factor, and that gets into a number of things that happen physically. And while some people intuitively say, you know, if a baby sleeps on their stomach, they're less likely to choke, it is actually 180 degrees the opposite literally because of our anatomy. You're safer on your back from choking. That's the major modifiable one. Prematurity, without question, is a major risk factor for sudden unexplained infant death, or SIDS. We can talk forever about what we can do about prematurity, but babies born too early are real. They're here. They're not going away. We should work to make fewer of those, so to speak. But that is, again, a major risk factor. So one has to be even more careful in those circumstances. Again, no loose objects around a baby, blankets, etc. They should not have necklaces, bracelets, etc. in the first year of life.
Is there, you mentioned premature, and that could be another in focus. We can do that again. We can go into that. But what about the age of the infant?
Right. So when we talk about sudden unexplained infant death, we are talking 1 month. Most of the time we were saying 1 month to the first birthday. The age of the infant can be anywhere in the year, but let's concentrate for argument's sake for the first 4 or 5 months of life. Okay. And let's really look at that as a particular vulnerable risk period in addition to the first month of life, but more infant deaths in the first month really have to do with medical problems and extreme prematurity. Smoking during pregnancy, whether it's the mother, anyone else in the household, is a risk factor. There is something about that that changes something about the baby and makes them more at risk. So smoking during pregnancy isn't good no matter what. It's not good anyway. There's something to think about. Certainly then smoking in the household after a child is born, again, is not healthy for the mom or the baby or anyone else. So that becomes a factor. Bed sharing, which in our county, in our part of the state, occurs probably 50% of the time, or in 50% of the nights, or in any night, 50% of kids for a period of time are sharing a bed with a parent.
Oh, with a parent, okay.
With a parent or someone else, but let's say a parent, again, is a risk factor. And we recognize there's a closeness to sharing the bed, but there is a risk to sharing the bed. You fall asleep, you don't know how you're going to move. Oh, I know when the baby's in trouble. You don't, because this is a silent event. So bed sharing. Unsafe sleep surfaces. So I said, crib, bassinet, pack and play on your back. Sleeping on a couch for a baby. They can fall into the corner. They often, when it's on a couch, are there with someone else who falls asleep. Babies should not sleep in car seats. It's not a good position. The head flops forward. So the position, the location really make a big difference.
What about gendered? Is there a difference between boys and girls?
Small, but not one that I would hang much on at this point, because it's not a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 difference.
And medical history?
Medical history, as I said, prematurity is one thing. Certainly serious congenital problems, cardiac, heart, respiratory problems also become part of this. Those, however, tend to be ones where the cause will probably be ascribed to the medical condition rather than an unexplained death, although, again, death during sleep is devastating no matter what. Death in period in any infant is devastating.
So if this is a question for you, this is the law enforcement aspect, if there are more than one child in the family who died from SIDS, does that change the role of the investigation?
Absolutely. I mean, an investigation generally has a very broad scope, and any information that can explain the cause of death is going to be considered and is potentially influential to the conclusions of the investigation. So, certainly we're looking for criminal activity first and foremost, but when accidents and tragedies occur, that's something that we're left with and the family is left with, and in those cases, like our partnership with Bay State is talking about prevention.
And then is it common for that to happen, where there could be 2 children in a family that have died from SIDS?
Certainly a previous death from SIDS is a risk factor for a future one as well. So we're not talking about events that are common to begin with, but it is another risk factor.
And then what are some of the laws related to SIDS?
Well, there aren't laws necessarily related to SIDS. Our focus is protecting children, and when we conduct investigations, we're ensuring that children are in safe environments. And when we're looking back, investigating something that's already happened, the focus is on what happened to that child, and was it preventable, and was it criminal? In my role, given this particular responsibility of investigating unattended deaths, is now focusing prospectively to say, what can we do to reduce those tragedies? They're outside of the criminal realm, really. When crimes do happen, they're prosecuted, and we've unfortunately had parents and other family members being prosecuted for causing abuse and ultimately causing the death of children, which are very sad cases, obviously. But we're in a posture now where we're trying to breed awareness, spread awareness around how SIDS deaths can be prevented, and there are some ways that can happen.
All right. We're going to continue our conversation here. We're going to return and discuss more ways on prevention. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we are talking about sudden infant death syndrome, and we've talked about the possible risks that could lead to SIDS. If we want to talk a little bit more about prevention, we've talked about this too, but let's delve a little bit deeper into this. What are some of the preventative measures? You mentioned the sleeping conditions, the surroundings. And I know that when we have new moms, we want to buy all the great new things. It's probably a good idea to buy a new crib. You don't want to have the hand-me-down anymore, right?
That's absolutely true, because it's only been for the last 10 years, give or take, that by safety standards, the cribs have slats that are close enough together that a baby cannot have a head lodge between the slats.
So
You don't want hand-me-down.
And then also just the stuff that is in the crib. There probably shouldn't be a lot of stuff in there besides the baby.
No, and that's one of the odd things, because if you look at a picture of the ideal crib with a baby in it, it is pretty empty, and yet people are enamored of stuff. And we did this with our child as well, but it really is supposed to be alone on your back in a crib, no bumpers, at least at the beginning in the first 4 or 5 months or 1 year of life. Sleep sacks are good. Babies do not have to be heavily bundled. They should be dressed the same way that you or I would for the environment. So we recommend sleep sacks at this point, and there are also certainly sleeper outfits that work as well.
What about pacifiers?
Pacifiers are now promoted at sleep, particularly for babies who are breastfeeding. They are beneficial. And I will parenthetically say that I have a new grandchild, 2 weeks old, and my daughter sent a video yesterday of the first pacifier used by her baby. And it's pretty cute, but every baby is cute, so I shouldn't go on that one.
And then, I mean, obviously new technology pops up all the time.
Yeah.
Baby monitors are used.
Baby monitors are controversial, and we have backed off of baby monitors a lot at this point because the data says that they don't save lives. There are circumstances certainly where baby monitors are recommended, certain medical conditions where children are at higher risk, perhaps with past instances in the household. But by and large, baby monitors have not been demonstrated to save lives.
All right. What about immunizations?
Immunizations are good. It is flu shot season, but not for your baby under 6 months of age.
Okay.
Immunizations are not a risk factor for SIDS nor autism. That's been debunked, but immunizations are good things. I would hesitate to say, except in rare instances, that they are life-saving when it comes to SIDS itself, although that concept is still being worked out.
And now back to the law enforcement aspect of this. When a situation does arise where you're investigating or looking into this, who is it that actually goes to the home and interviews the caregivers, the parents?
Typically, it's a detective. It depends based on where that happens. I have state troopers who work in my office, and if something happens in Springfield, the Springfield Police Department investigates those kinds of cases at my direction. But irrespective of where this happens, the detective is trained in how to deal with these situations, trained with the things to look for, whether it's identifying abuse or signs of abuse on children, to look at the environment in which this happens. So investigators, irrespective of state police or Springfield police, are very qualified to deal with these unique kinds of situations.
And within your office, you have a specific department that focuses on this?
I do. I created a special victims unit which focuses on crimes against children, whether that's physical abuse or sexual abuse, and in these instances we work very closely with investigators who are responding to baby deaths. The prosecutors who work are highly trained, highly specialized, and very familiar with these kinds of cases, both from a criminal standpoint as well as a medical standpoint, working very closely with Bay State and its doctors to understand what abuse looks like versus what is SIDS versus what is other accidental or medical issues that cause the death.
I want to talk a little bit more about the collaboration as well, but first I want to, when SIDS happens, parents oftentimes feel guilty. What did I do wrong? How do you reassure them that maybe it likely wasn't anything that they could have done differently?
That's an excellent question, and I will take us back on that topic to the early 90s. We had a child fatality review public health process done, and what we found, one of the major findings was that grief counseling at that time was insufficient. Grief in and of itself plus the guilt aspect, and we tried to improve the people, the resources for grief counseling. And that's one of the main reasons, is we can sit here and talk about risk factors. Mm-hmm. True. As you say, the human response when you've lost a child, certainly in this circumstance, part of that response is, what did I do? And you can blame yourself forever, but you can't change what happened. One has to be there to support the individual, to allow their feelings to come out, and the feelings are going to come out for a long time. And I think District Attorney Gallooni's staff can say that because they're dealing with people on site at the time, and probably a much harder circumstance than even the emergency room. Being there, listening, validating their feelings. You can say it's not your fault, but it doesn't sink in until people work through the rest of it. And we have to be cautious when we talk about risk factors to not blame individuals. We are talking about events that happen 35 to 40 in the Commonwealth in a year. They're not common, but each one is devastating, and more than one is even more devastating. And you are helping somebody through that period of devastation to become whole again so that they can move forward and not encourage the community not to point fingers.
I have about 1 minute left, and I want to talk about this collaboration because it gets back to the preventative aspect here. Both of your offices basically working together here. Explain that collaboration. Start with you.
Sure. So my office, the Hampden DA's office, and Bay State have collaborated across many different issues. But on safe sleep, we've identified a place where we're both highly concerned. And the effect of this is really getting out to the community about safe sleep practices to make sure that new parents of infants understand what are appropriate conditions for sleep, which Dr. Balder talked about throughout this segment. And we're interested in getting that out as broadly as possible because we understand SIDS is often unexplained, but there are risk factors and sleep conditions are a big piece of that. So through the Hampden DA's office and Bay State Health, we're really concerned about educating new parents about how they can protect their babies even while they sleep.
Doing so with the video that you guys have put together?
Doing so with the video, doing so with every piece of messaging that we can come up with.
So new moms leaving Bay State get a chance to view this video, is that the idea?
Yes, they do. Yes. And we'll have it available in other ways.
Perfect, perfect. All right, we're going to have the last word after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus, and today we've been talking about sudden infant death syndrome, the risk factors and prevention measures to protect your baby. And that is our program for today. We want to thank our guests for joining us. We had Dr. Andrew Balder, a pediatrician at Bay State Health, and DA Anthony Gallooni. Thanks for coming on the program. And if you missed any of this, you can watch the full program on our website at WWLP.com. From all of us here at 22 News, have a good day.